Um, Welcome everyone to Talking Politics, a virtual series that is jointly organized by University of Chicago's Center for Study of Communication and Society, the University of Colorado Boulder's Program in Culture, Language, and Social Practice, and Brown University's Department of Anthropology. My name is Merve Çetin. I'm a second-year communication PhD student at CU Boulder, and I will be the moderator and discussant for today's webinar. I want to thank you, all of you, so much for joining us for this third edition of Talking Politics, where experts examine how language and other media shape the nexus of race, history, and political institutions. This year's edition primarily focuses on the 2024 US presidential election, but our programming also tracks the global movement of political discourses, media, and message. Today, we are very happy to have Leah Sprain and Nathan Schneider from University of Colorado Boulder joining us for a special election watch party. During this session, Leah and Nathan will share their fascinating research on electoral politics, and afterward, we will open the Zoom space as a relaxed, interactive spot to talk politics. To participate, you can raise your hand and we will call on you, or feel free to post questions and comments directly into the Zoom chat. We encourage your input throughout the webinar and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible after the presentations. However, as politics can be a sensitive topic, we aim to create a constructive and engaging environment for everyone, including our presenters. To that end, we will be moderating the discussion closely and will remove any inappropriate or unconstructive comments from the Q&A session as needed. To ask a question, you may look for Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click on the button, a new window will pop up where you may post a question. We encourage questions at any time during webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many of them as we can after the presentations. However, we understand that, again, like politics is a delicate subject, so we encourage you to be constructive and help us to make this a fruitful experience for everyone. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Leah Sprain. Leah Sprain's research focuses on democratic engagement, studying how specific communication practices facilitate and inhibit democratic action. Her research and teaching draw on language and social interaction perspectives to explore deliberation, environmental communication, and social movement activism. Thank you, Leah, for joining us. Today, Leah will share brief examples from her research on political extremism, deliberation, and candidate debates. Whenever you are ready, the stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have long been impressed by the Talking Politics group as one of the best examples of how pushed by pandemic we can use across university networks to think about shared topics. And so I'm excited to be with you all tonight. I feel like even the starting point is a little bit of a mea culpa. As we think about this occasion happening on election night, there are some ways in which I don't have narrow expertise focused on electoral politics. And so in a number of ways, I think part of what you'll be hearing me think about is, what is a group like this that probably is coming to tonight from a mix of research perspectives and also personal and political perspectives, making sense of a night that is full of all sorts of feelings and possibilities and communication activities. I'd be shocked if some of you don't also have group chats or other windows open. And I just want to invite and lean into this is a time when I've tried to design something that provides some openings to conversation. But if you are also bringing whatever it is that you're seeing and processing as it happens, that is most welcome. So I think, like many of you, I have a pretty broad range of how to think about politics and how my both research and outreach support political action is part of my politics. And I'm also showing up tonight and having election anxiety, like perhaps some of you, not just as a researcher, as other things too. And so I've been thinking a lot about that intersection and how to manage it. If at this point, anyone really what you're looking for are firmly distilled insights on electoral politics. In other words, you want experts who've really thought about this. You're probably not going to get that from the next 15 minutes from me, but I put a link in the chat to the conversation, which is a place where academics can distill their research in ways that speak to current events. And you'll find lots of great resources there. So feel free to browse that if that's what you need right now. What I have to give you is a little bit of a reminder between what might feel very Boulder to some of you, that, you know, we do some taking of breaths. We realize that this is a moment where we don't probably have deep attention spans. And I've probably designed a talk that acknowledges that more than I should. But I will try to give you a few snippets that give you a few ways into thinking about my research and perhaps some themes connected to research and politics and talk that might identify with some of you. I've always studied talk and politics broadly imagined. As a PhD student, I was working on 2 projects right when I finished my PhD. I was part of convening a nationwide network to look at an attempt by Bill McKibben to develop a social movement on climate change called Step It Up 2007, a name that clearly dates me as old. And simultaneously, I was doing my dissertation research, which looked at a fair trade coffee cooperative in Nicaragua, where I was looking at local notions of democracy, how those connected to international requirements for fair trade to be democratically controlled, and ultimately had me looking at cultural notions of meetings. I share these examples in part because I think some of you might also have this very capacious notion of talk and politics and democracy. And part of what I realized in that combination is both I was seeking to research things that created sites of possibility, of world making, of imagining the type of relations that I thought would be good for the world. And also, if I was going to do research that made a difference, it benefited from what, at least at the time, I with some colleagues called transdisciplinary networked research. In other words, that it benefited from being connected to transdisciplinary networks of people and ideas and places and experiments and projects where there are active connections between research and people doing things in the world. And that part of what I came away from my fieldwork in Nicaragua with is I met lovely, amazing people, and I deeply appreciated getting to do research there. And they did not need a communication scholar hanging out with them at all. In fact, most of the questions I was asking, prompted by my committee about their meetings, were pretty boring at best to them. And they really could have used some agronomists to help them think about climate change, because that's what they were struggling with. And so this perspective really let me to make sure the choices I was making about research were, as best I could, fitted in response with relationship with people, not on campus, where I was doing work with them and research was coming out of that. So much of my research has been something that's kind of captured in this image here. This is a graphic image that actually comes from some ethnographic research that tries to capture Boulder's civic communication landscape, and a way of thinking about kind of local politics in a way that acknowledges that there are absolutely city-led spaces. And I've often worked with working groups and civic dialogues and also city council meetings to analyze using discourse analysis and the ethnography of communication to see what happens in those spaces. But they are in conversation and embedded with community-led spaces and media to create a really robust communication ecosystem. And within this robust communication ecosystem, as we start thinking about electoral politics, this, I think, in some useful ways, decenters electoral politics as the thing and way in which we do politics. And yet, at different moments in my career, I've been pulled into thinking about how those can be combined. One of the first ways was in a process that's called the Citizens Initiative Review. And this is a process that takes a group of demographically diverse folks who represent the state or the city or the place where there's an initiative under review that is a proposal that will be taken to the voters to vote up or down. And if it passes, it's voted into law. That this group will spend 3 to 5 days really hearing from experts and pro and con people making arguments, and then the group will deliberate about it and ultimately formulate a statement about it. And at least in the state of Oregon, whatever this group of everyday folks determines and puts on the citizen statement, it actually goes in the official Oregon voters pamphlet. And part of this institutional structure, I would argue, is a really important part of thinking about this deliberative innovation. So much so that I've fully observed a citizens initiative review, been part of multiple different deliberative designs. And I really appreciate that this is a nice example that shows that the democratic design itself shapes what research questions and methods are sometimes most needed. And colleagues of mine have actually showed that when a group of everyday citizens does this, that we can use a bunch of social science approaches to both understand that they take it seriously, that it's effective in a variety of ways, and perhaps even more importantly, that everyday voters read it and it influences their decisions, and people prefer this influence to any other form of advocate. Those are research questions that I, as mostly a language and social interaction person, am not going to answer. But it's an important reminder how we think about this nexus of democratic innovation and the ways in which research can contribute. The next two stories I'm going to tell you come from some work that I've done in Colorado. For anyone who just needs a reminder, this is where we are. The red piece, the red pin to the right is Boulder, where the University of Colorado Boulder is located. And the left is at least close to Grand Junction, which is the major city on what is called the western slope of Colorado. And the Office for Public and Community Engaged Scholarship at CU Boulder has been trying to respond to the fact that Boulder doesn't always serve the entire state very well, and so put together a program called the Higher Education and Democracy Fellows, and they wanted to help us respond to something that's captured here. This is the 2020 results from the House election in Colorado, and this map may look a lot like maps you're familiar with, where places we might think of as one color are actually vividly multiple. And in particular, that Boulder is located in that blue blob, one of the districts where we've regularly elected Democrats. And the Western Slope, the left-hand side of the state, is a place that was represented by, in this election, Lauren Boebert. And in response to that election, this group brought me to Western Colorado, where we started meeting with two community organizations that were facing real crises of democracy in their community and really were interested in researchers helping them out with it. The League of Women Voters, which is a national organization, as many of you may know, that has deep roots in the suffragist movement and continues to see itself, as you see here, as a nonpartisan grassroots organization. They were really struggling with something they had done a lot, which is host forums. And what they were really struggling with is, what questions can we ask of candidates in order to get good answers? They were perhaps a little chagrined that despite the fact that language and social interaction scholars study so many things about questions, we cannot guarantee answers. We have lots of detailed ways of accounting for why we can't guarantee answers. But nonetheless, this engagement helped me kind of dig into some of what they were doing with forums. And that research subsequently took me to a place that is perhaps a little bit surprising. I started looking deeply at debate moderation, and among my data, over time, my data set included debate moderation that went viral like this.
You resigned your position as House Minority Leader after your drunk driving arrest surfaced this year. And my question is not about what you did while drunk, which for anybody who missed it was speeding up I-25 at 90 miles per hour so fast a trooper thought that you were trying to race him. Then you reached for your gun during the traffic stop. You asked the trooper to call the State Patrol's lobbyist. Then you asked him to keep the arrest out of the media. My question to you is about what you did while sober. You did not disclose your drunk driving arrest to your Republican colleagues when they were considering you for leader and electing you.
Yeah.
What does that tell voters about your judgment?
Well, thank you, Kyle, for that. I mean,
Is it a mistake not to tell your colleagues when they were considering you for leader, knowing that you had something so big and embarrassing in your recent past?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, this happened to.
That was about the softest reference that he could have made, but you want to talk about the theater thing?
Sure. So, Kyle, I certainly have owned up to my night out in Denver. Go back to
We're
my
actually not going to do that. You had plenty of time to answer the question. You chose not to. That's fine. I just want to make sure. And you have apologized for the theater incident.
I certainly have.
And I just want to make sure. Did you apologize for the behavior that went on with you and your date or the vaping, or did you apologize, or pardon me, or did you apologize for lying to voters about what you did that night and the disrespect that you showed to service workers that night? What specifically were you apologizing for?
I don't believe getting footage and releasing that. And
that is perhaps enough of that. But part of what this TikTok begins to show is how what might be seen as basic research about the League of Women Voters becomes broader research about thinking about the range of ways in which we can do debate moderation. And what I end up doing is using data like this to show a variety of techniques that moderators use, and then how those do and don't connect to different situated premises. The League of Women Voters, to be clear, is never going to do what you see Kyle Clark do here. They're never going to interrupt. They're never going to use some of these tactics of pursuit, and they certainly will not kind of talk over and use what are seen as really adversary techniques. And also, they benefit from seeing techniques that people like Kyle do, like drawing attention to unanswered questions. And so if any of this becomes interesting and you're interested in forms that include a lot more details and specifics and data that you didn't see here, what you might be interested in is I'll be sharing some of that more kind of detailed research in a later talk where I talk about how is it that we kind of make non-answers hearable, and is that actually something that's really responsive to what League of Women Voters was looking for, and that we can use data like Kyle Clark to help us see the range of ways that that might be accomplished. The person on the left of our TikTok window is Lauren Boebert. And she is a main character in the last story I want to share. She has somewhat of a national reputation, and in combination with January 6th, becomes part of why a group called Restore the Balance forms, saying that they really want to reject political extremism and try to organize for a different way of doing politics. This group has caught fire, as you can see in this image. There have been several additional kind of satellite groups that have formed. They've had several thousand members who have signed a pledge and petition, and they still regularly have meetings where several hundred people will show up. And in a town of about 60,000, having a group that still has 500 people show up to their events shows you that I think that they kind of tapped into something. And in conversation with this group, what we started to do is really think about what is this language of political extremism doing, and what impacts have they had or not had on the conversation around it. And with some colleagues, we've been able to use Letters to the Editor as a site to look empirically both before and after Restore the Balance. And I'll give you just a taste of some of the things that we're finding there. So before Restore the Balance, there's almost no public conversation in about 10 years of Letters to the Editor about extremism as an issue. But people do call each other extremists. This happens in a couple of patterned ways. Radical environmentalists, later climate environmentalists, are called extremists. And in response, sometimes we see specific people say, no, that's mischaracterization made by those radical right-wing extremists. So if there's a polarity, it's between environmentalists and the right wing. Some specific politicians are called extremists, and we have a little bit, especially getting to 2021, or 2020 and 2021, around kind of fraud believers and partisan politics. Once Restore the Balance forms, we start having this really robust public conversation about extremism. It's happening in letters all the time, and more people are being called extremists. Other letter writers are being called extremists, Christians are being called extremists, Supreme Court justices, the media, television stations. We have this polarity between the extremist minority and the silent majority. Letter writers are always part of that majority, of course, and so on. And this leads to being what I would consider extremism being called essentially contested. And this is captured a little bit in this letter more directly, where you have someone write, being anti-extremist is very much like being anti-racist or anti-anything else, that you become the thing that you are supposedly against. Now, some of you may have strong reactions to this, in part because you don't buy the easy way in which being anti-something instantly cancels it out as being legitimate. That it feels a little bit too much like the Spider-Man meme, where anything that approximates anything else instantly kind of nullifies and makes it meaningless. But I would argue that this process of looking at how the language of extremism gets connected to calling out other people and actually accusing them of being extremists helps us think about how language works in some of these controversies, especially the ways in which it maps onto partisan politics. There's interesting discourses of both sidesism, where Restore the Balance gets accused of being biased because they don't have equal numbers of extremists on both sides. And so we see these relationships between partisan politics and affective polarization and extremism come together in some really interesting ways. One more kind of slight side note, Restore the Balance tries to set themselves up as being above the fray, as having identified the things that shouldn't be contested at all. And in fact, anyone who contests what they say maybe shouldn't be trusted. And I think this raises some really interesting questions about the extent to which democracy rests on contestation, or whether we really can have universal norms. And I would argue that these are important questions perhaps to ask in moments like election nights, where we see the consequences of both contestation and the desire to have things that ground us, but especially when people we may agree with are suggesting that they are uncontroversially to be agreed with, maybe we should be a bit skeptical as well. So where does this all add up? I've just given you a talk that doesn't have like one perfect through line. Again, I warned you about the attention span thing. You may be feeling it too. But I hope this illustrates a couple of the ways in which I would argue that complexities around talk and politics remain interesting in all sorts of ways. There's lots of opportunity for talk to shape politics, and that this continued consideration of democratic innovations, empirical research, and normative values may help some of you find openings. I have to admit, I never thought I would be studying things that were so intimately connected to electoral politics. I assumed that the things I was interested in just didn't have much traction at all within big scale national politics. I worked at the local level. I thought mostly about talk and interaction. And these projects gave me some ways to realize that that idea of working with community partners who are invested in things sometimes gives you openings to think about talk in politics in ways that you wouldn't expect. And yet I hope, and I've seen some evidence that they still have some of the outcomes from research that I'm hoping to cultivate. So thanks.
Thank you, Leah, for those fantastic insights. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Nathan Schneider. Nathan Schneider is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Economies Design Lab. His most recent book is Governable Spaces, Democratic Design for Online Life, which we will be discussing in his solo webinar as a part of Talking Politics 2024. Today, Nathan will discuss some of the democratic methods we are not using in this election and explore new methods of decision-making emerging around the world and online. We are excited to hear what he has to share. Nathan, stage is yours whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leah. I think this, what I have to share builds on what you shared, thinking about not just the night we're having together here, but the experiences that maybe we're not having and that we could be having. And I think those experiences are really important. I'm also a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm in the Media Studies department. And I'm also currently board chair of an organization called MetaGov, which is a laboratory for the theory and practice and study and experimentation of governance in the digital age. And so it's from a lot of that work that I'll be speaking. I begin with a question of experience. Today I had class with a bunch of my students who voted for the first time, or maybe the second time. And I was really curious about their experiences with that. Some of them were really confused about the process, weren't sure their votes were counted. Those experiences matter profoundly. I think about why I care about democracy in my research and work throughout my career. And I think it's really because I had some good early experiences with it. When I was a teenager, I was part of a process to change a policy at the school board that altered an admissions policy. Later on, I was part of cooperatives and saw kind of direct democracy firsthand. So those kinds of experiences have been really formative for me. And so I'm always wondering, what experiences are people having with democracy? Because I think they really shape how we approach what this whole thing is about. And I come at this from the premise that I think our system of democratic governance is in profound trouble. This line is one symptom of it. The idea that people have to wait and perhaps risk being late for school or work in order to vote is just a profound symptom of something wrong. We're seeing much more profound symptoms of things being wrong with our democracy with each successive election. And clearly we have some real work to do. This is a system designed largely around horse and buggy and a kind of technology, a technological world of the Constitution, for instance, that we no longer have. And also a kind of set of planetary crises that were not part of the set of challenges people were facing in the 19th century and the 18th century. And I think we need to explore seriously what it would look like to build structures of governance that are really equal to meeting both the opportunities we have for being heard, as well as the profoundly global, dynamic, emergent challenges that we face. Many of the structures that we've relied on for addressing problems of governance, not just elections, but also things like unions, social movements have run into real struggles trying to get a foothold in the systems we confront today. And there are lots of ways we can approach those kinds of problems. But the experiences we have of democratic governance, I think, is an important piece of the picture, because democracy really doesn't work if people can't feel a sense that their power is real. And I think there are some interesting opportunities for how we could upgrade the so-called user experience of governance. This isn't to say that there's a technological solution for these problems. These are deeply social and cultural problems. But I do think there are opportunities to shift the terrains on which we self-govern, to upgrade the infrastructure of our mutual governance. First, let's just review where we are. We vote every 4 years, again, like we still ride to Washington in carriages. We have the same kind of cadence of input, of voice, in at least what I call effective voice as opposed to affective voice. We can always say things out into the ether, but the opportunities for direct forms of power and intervention are still pretty much the same that we've been doing for a couple hundred years. In the United States, at least, this we've calcified into a two-party system that makes it very hard for other kinds of for voices outside of those two parties to emerge, that limit the possibilities of political imagination and political positions, that don't capture the preferences and perspectives and experiences of many of us, and produce a kind of an experience often of feeling unheard because we don't sort evenly, cleanly into one of those parties. And if you look at people's perspectives on the people we're electing through all these processes, the politicians, it turns out we have pretty low opinions of these people anyway. All of them as a category. Not to say there aren't good people in the mix, there are many, but that something about the way we encounter them through the systems of governance we have ends up resulting in leaving us with pretty low opinions, particularly of the institutions collectively. Say, when you ask people, what do you think of Congress? How is it going? The ratings are pretty profoundly low. So what could we do about some of these things? Some of the ideas I'm going to be talking through are things that have been discussed among political scientists and democracy reformers for a long time. Some are quite a bit newer, but I think it's interesting to see them together. And in my work at MetaGov in particular, I am often trying to convene conversations across these spaces of experimentation. And in each case, these are efforts to deepen the opportunities for high quality voice from people to enter into structures of power, and in turn for people to feel their own power, to have those kinds of experiences that are so often missing. The first may be familiar to many of you. It's a process called participatory budgeting. This comes out in its recent forms out of experiments decades ago in Brazil, Porto Alegre, Brazil. And this model has moved from south to north. It's been adopted in many parts of Europe, in cities in the United States. The city of Denver here in Colorado is now running a participatory budgeting process. New York, many US cities have adopted this. What it means is that part of the budget is set aside for people to participate in deciding on priorities that they want to pursue, and then making decisions among those priorities. Here, the participants in the process, which can and often do include, for instance, people who can't vote, like people who are under the age of 18, people who may not be citizens. Jurisdictions can set the rules as they like. But the goal is to ensure that people who are involved in a community are able to shape not just the question of who represents them, but actually to identify priorities that those representatives themselves might not be able to identify, to enable ideas to bubble up. And this is a process that can enable that kind of experience, that tangible experience with governance that we don't get to have when we're just voting for a representative. I promised to talk about tools and technologies. There are increasingly tools being used, developed platforms. For instance, Stanford University has a platform for participatory budgeting. But this is a process that you can do with stickies and whiteboards too. It doesn't necessarily require technologies, though or at least like internet-enabled technology software, but those could help facilitate these processes, make them smoother. Another is citizen assemblies. This is a process that has been slower to come to the United States, but has been being used at increasingly large scales, including national scales in Europe, in Africa. It's also used in local and regional contexts in China, so increasingly widespread. This is where you take a jury of peers. You know, this is in some respects what they did in ancient Greece. You take a jury of citizens to make a decision together. I'm really interested in this model, partly because I once had the opportunity to sit on a trial jury in Brooklyn, New York, and that too was one of the most powerful political experiences of my life, having to come to consensus with a group of people with whom I shared ostensibly very little. But we had to come together, learn about each other, come to trust each other, and make a really impactful decision together. Now we're starting to apply that logic of a randomly selected jury to making decisions, or at least developing proposals. And this is being used especially in contexts where legislatures get stuck and aren't quite sure how to proceed. And assemblies are able to kind of cut through the political noise by being nonpartisan. Another thing I like about assemblies is that a lot of the people who, when I think of, when I ask myself, who would I want to say be president? A lot of the people who I think of immediately, people in my life and my family, you know, are exactly the kind of people who would never say, I'm going to run for president. You know, I think sometimes the best people in our lives are the people who would never put themselves through that or put themselves up for it because they're just too humble. And I love the way in which assemblies invite people in, rather than kind of choosing based on the logic of who thinks they should be in charge. Now we're getting a little more experimental. This is an output of a tool called Polis. It's a tool that's been developed over the last decade or so, and it uses some machine learning. It uses a process where people agree or disagree with a series of prompts, brief sentences, kind of tweet-length sentences, and then it clusters them around shared opinion. And one of the things that's interesting about this tool is that it helps reveal potential alliances and connections and points of agreement that parties don't reveal. You know, often there are things that we agree about across political parties, but we don't see them because the party is the technique for opinion aggregation. And this enables us to have much finer views on the ways in which people might agree or disagree. So this tool has been useful for helping to surface, again, like assemblies, helping to surface options that maybe weren't visible already, and to also identify coalitions. Some of the people behind this tool have suggested that with techniques like this, we might someday consider political parties obsolete. Now, I'm not sure that that's the right strategy, but I think it's an interesting proposition to imagine. What if instead we were able to replace the technology of the party with a technology that enables us to have much more issue-focused, fine-grained coalitions? Speaking of which, another technique that has been growing in use in online contexts is called liquid democracy. It's a form of delegation that, you know, draws on practices that we've seen in a lot of other contexts, including, say, proxy voting for corporate, annual meetings and that sort of thing. But the technique has been experimented among a number of newer online organizations. And the logic is that you delegate your vote to somebody who you trust and who is willing to maybe be more involved than you are. So say I'm really interested in climate policy, but I'm not really interested in fiscal policy. I don't know much about it. And so I'm going to delegate my vote to somebody who I think I trust on that policy. but I can keep my vote on issues of climate policy and vote myself. So it's kind of direct democracy. Everybody votes on everything except you have this option of delegating those votes to anybody else in the system. Those people in turn can delegate their vote. So representation is fluid. It's not a thing where you say, okay, every 4 years, I'm giving you this vote on everything. It says, I'm giving you this vote on this issue right now, but I can repeal it at any time the second you do something I don't like. So this, again, allows us to have some of the benefits of representation. I don't have to study every issue, become an expert on it, but it does enable us to have the chance to make decisions more flexibly, and if we want to, participate more directly in decision making. This is, again, a little more sci-fi. This is a model called conviction voting, which one of my fellow board members at MetaGov helped develop. It's a technique that's been largely adopted in the context of blockchains. You might think of this just as a world of scams and, and fake tokens and things like this. Donald Trump has been embracing it lately in some interesting ways. But it's also been a context where there's been some really interesting governance design experiments. And conviction voting is a technique where actually time matters. So how long you stake some tokens in a decision affects your voice in that decision, and how many tokens you put in. So this is a model among some other models and around these kinds of mechanism design that try to get a sense of how much you care about something and include that intensity of preference in your vote. Whereas in our current system, right, somebody who is kind of like, I guess I'll vote for that proposition, is counted equally with somebody who is obsessed and deeply studied and is deeply concerned with that issue. So this is one of many ways that people are experimenting with to try to include a sense of degree and stake. How much are you willing to put up? How much are you willing to maybe limit your voice on other issues in order to be able to decide on this issue? So conviction voting also, again, rewards people who have long-term commitments over those who just made their decision yesterday. We've seen some headlines, for people who are like, okay, I made my decision because of the Joe Rogan endorsement yesterday. Maybe that vote should count less than somebody who has been thinking about it for months and or years and made the decision much earlier and has stuck with that decision. So how can these things be applied? There have been some contexts where some governments have really taken up the banner of democratic experimentation around the world. One of my favorite cases is Taiwan, especially under the leadership of the former digital minister, Audrey Tang. In a series of processes around contested issues like policies around Uber or policies around COVID, Tang and colleagues, really coming out of a social movement that occupied the legislature, developed a system of citizen input using a range of digital tools. For instance, using this tool Polis to help identify clusters of interest. And they pieced these tools together into a system called V-Taiwan that is a kind of model of what it could look like to build an integrated digital citizenship model. Barcelona has also supported, also out of social movement work, the social movements elected a mayor who created space for developing a platform called Decidim, which enables the selection of different modules for self-governance. So it's amazing to see. It's kind of like the plugins for a WordPress website. You can pick plugins to do all sorts of things. In Decidim, you can pick plugins for all different kinds of decision making. And it's really neat to see that menu of options and to see how different jurisdictions could mix and match them to create the appropriate forms of input and decision making for them. I've been involved in some experiments. My lab has built a web interface called Community Rule to help small groups develop just some basic rules. We've developed a mod for online games to experiment with enabling diverse forms of self-governance. We've done historical research about what it could look like, or about how we could have a wider palette of examples from which to draw in developing the next generation of democratic experiences. There's much more still to learn. For instance, we need to find a balance in these experiments that are both computationally efficient, sophisticated, appropriate, but also intuitive for people. So as people are engaged in these systems, they can understand what they're doing. And this is a big problem. For instance, we're voting on ranked choice voting here in Colorado this election. The question of whether it's understandable by most voters has been a big issue in that discussion. Is it culturally appropriate? This is a really important part of governance. Governance is embedded in culture. We learn governing cultures as we grow up in the world that we're in. You know, my kids today just before this, I was doing an event with my daughter's Girl Scout troop about democracy. That is developing a culture of governance. And different cultures have different ways of thinking about how power should flow. We need to make sure that we're more attentive to the diversity of governance cultures we have among us, and to develop tools and experiences that meet those. We also need to address the information economy, or the attention economy, to make sure to design tools that are really sensitive to the pressures on people's attention, and to make sure that people really can give their attention where it's most needed, but also not get exhausted. I think we can also learn from governance practices that just make it fun. This is a poster for one of our Colorado Rural Electric Cooperative meetings. Someone dressed up in a robot goes to those meetings, and along with great food, people are drawn in by the party to participate in governance in their local, or regional rural electric cooperatives. So we need to make sure that the new governance experiences are things that people will really want to participate in. Again, I think of my kids a lot in this. I want to ensure that they have better kinds of governance experiences than I've had, than my students are having right now, that they get to have the right combination of work and play and feel that their voice is really being heard. Thank you so much. Again, I'm going to do a talk on my book, Governable Spaces, next month in this context. I'm really looking forward to that. Or maybe it's later. I forget exactly the date. We can put it in the chat. But if you're interested in more of this conversation, please check out Metagov at metagov.org. It's a big community full of people who are exploring these kinds of experiments. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan, for that insightful presentation. Again, thank you both so much. You were inspirational. We will now open the floor for Q&A. Please use Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to post your questions or raise your hands. Actually, I have a question. I have two questions. First, to Leah. I really love that you mentioned democratic design shapes our research design too, the research questions we ask and its answers. So my question is in your research, how can we observe that in your research designs?
I don't think I have an instant answer here. I think sometimes it is connected to what we want to learn about something. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about these experiments, like you heard in both the talks, sometimes we're drawn to pieces that are the hardest to research. Like we want to know if it's effective at guaranteeing certain outcomes. And a lot of these experiments, that's possible, but proving it happens all the time is actually really hard. And sometimes that's not the point. I have to admit, in some situations, I managed this by collaborating with people and piecing together a particular situation, what questions I think need to be answered, and who has the disciplinary expertise. So like in the Citizens Initiative review piece, I did a week of ethnographic observation. I did other field notes. I helped them look at transcripts, and ultimately many of the things they were interested in wanted other methods, and that was okay. And so I think there's a little bit of a give and take. I will say one benefit of being in some of these spaces is that I often have I'm engaged in stuff that becomes data, and so I'm actually able to ask questions after the fact. I don't go into things necessarily planning an exact question. So if you think about experiments like citizens' assemblies, I've been part of some of those, and sometimes I'm hired as a facilitator or a co-designer, and we do the whole thing, and then we have especially interactional data, and we can say, what can we learn from how this went or didn't go, and ask questions. And that's kind of a luxury, I think, sometimes of interactional data that other approaches don't have.
Oh, thank you, Leah. I think like I'll save my question to Nathan for later. I'm gonna use my privilege to be in here, Colorado. Maybe I'll ask him later. I see Jake has a question in the chat. So can you see the question, or do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, I can see it. He's asking
Okay,
about whether the alternative methods are prone to abuse by extremist parties, like clustering of groups, and could it be, could some of these tools be swung into partisanship? Do they work best in two-party versus one-party? I think it's really important to recognize that any governance system is many, many pieces. One thing that actually got me obsessed with this research in recent years was I went to a conference where a lot of really techie people were really excited about one mechanism called quadratic voting. And they were basically like, let's just apply this method to everything and it will solve governance, right? And as I was hearing this, like, I think quadratic voting is really interesting. Our state legislature has been using it for some internal priority processes and things like that. It's an interesting thing. But it just made me think about how any healthy governance culture involves not just the mechanisms, but involves the norms. It involves the cultures. It involves different forms of overlapping power. And I think when you look at any mechanism on its own is gameable. Creating resilient governance systems requires really putting them into practice and developing structures of culture and norms around them and getting the right mix. And it's that kind of combination that that I think is really essential. It is true. Any system, like any new system, any old system, is gameable. The question for me is, how do we combine them right, so that we get outcomes that really reflect our culture and our needs and our many cultures, and so it's always going to be a give and take. I do think there are risks to changing up systems because our institutions may not have adapted. For instance, in the ranked choice voting vote right now, our Democratic Party in Colorado, which has just come into majority power, is very nervous about something changing that could make them lose that. And so it's always this is a question I think is really best answered in practice rather than, in a kind of pure theory.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, let's hear from Sydney.
Thank you both. I have a comment for Leah and a question for Nathan. I'm in Iowa right now, and I also work a lot in Georgia with Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. So your research reminds me a lot of my own in those ways. And I've noticed a similar, the word radical is coming up in the same way that the word extreme and your examples are. And I've noticed that I listen to the radio a lot here, and they've dropped, like, a lot of right-wing ads recently have dropped the word. radical leftist to just call people radicals. And it's become like kind of a like radical as a negative and radical as an understood. They mean radical leftist, but just the phrase she's a radical. And it's the women that are running too, which I think may add another level of what is being coded in that word. But now they're just using the word radical, and that means all these other things. And then Nathan, kind of on the same question that was just noted, can you explain a little bit more about the cluster model, not just as a model for like understanding after the fact what groups are actually feeling similarly or different, but as a voting form itself? I think I'm a little confused because I work with a lot of farmers that I'm kind of studying some of the ways that they think they're talking about the same thing or agree when they really don't, and some of the ways that they do agree but don't realize. And I think one of the things I would see like in a cluster, if I created that for my participants, is some of them would go, well, I don't like that person. So I don't like, my disagreement with them actually isn't revolving around the issue, it's revolving around their identity, like a lot of biases, a lot of things about like, I thought we agree on a family farm, but now that I realize your idea of a family is different, I don't like you and I don't want to support. So like, how do you figure out what happens when someone doesn't like that they're clustered together? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really interesting question. I'd love to hear more about your research. A lot of my work has drawn on legacies from economic democracy and agricultural communities. So, those conversations are really interesting. In terms of the tool, the way it works is just through statements, and it's largely been used not to make a decision, but to identify points of overlap and to work toward proposal building and consensus building. So part of the hope of the tool in this context would be to say, to enable those people who think they don't like each other because, you're a jerk, to actually recognize, wait a second, we actually cluster together a lot more than we might have expected. Maybe we need to rethink a possibility of a kind of alliance around this shared interest. That's the hope. And the way it was used, for instance, in the V Taiwan process was not to make decisions, but to identify points of potential consensus building, to overcome some of those. And I think, you're pointing to something interesting, which is the question of issue versus personalist politics, right? We're electing a president right now. That it's a very personalist thing. It's very vibey. It's very like, do you like this person? And there's a whole basket of policies related to that, but it's very much about the person. It's ultimately the sovereignty resides in the person. And a lot of these techniques I've been pointing to are actually implicitly or explicitly attempts to move politics out of the personal a bit. And that's something we could debate. Some people I've seen have been really skeptical of this model because they think, virtue ethics is something we should cultivate instead. We should spend more time cultivating better people, and that will solve our problems. So a lot of the things I presented really do attempt to like downplay the personal and elevate, the questions of policy.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Nathan. Leah, are you going to say something?
If just to buy time in case until there's a next question, if it's ever useful, I have interactional data from a land use planning game where there's no stakes. It's between a group between two different counties that disagree thinking about land use, but like there's no consequences. They're playing something that's explicitly a game and they follow all the rules in which we'd want people to be like, you keep talking about this as being really important. We can use that to think this. And interaction, what they do is reject, like, because it's someone they know disagrees with them, that they refuse the common ground offered to them in exactly their terms, because as long as someone they don't like is telling them the common ground, they want nothing to do with it. And so, Sydney, the like interactional dynamic you're pointing to is a real thing. And to see it happen in real time against the deliberative techniques when people are doing it in exactly how the theorist would want them to do it is both depressing and illuminating for whatever that's worth.
Thank you, Leah. Maybe like I can ask my question to Nathan right now. Like you mentioned citizen assemblies, like like these assemblies are made up of people who are nonpartisan. Like my question is like how can we reach out to these nonpartisan people? Because like to my impression, they are the ones not being really vocal about their political stances. So like they are really hard to identify. So how does this system work in those contexts? Oh, you are muted.
Sorry, 2020 mistake. I should clarify, it's not that it selects nonpartisan people. It's that it selects people in a nonpartisan way. So the way these assemblies work is that you have a kind of expectation of distribution, similar to like how a lot of polling works, right? Where you want to make sure to capture this distribution of like gender, ethnic identity, different kinds of demographic features that are important in your community, and you select people randomly, and then you make sure to try to meet that distribution. Partisan dynamics can form in these spaces where people revert to, what they have been told by their party, over the years, and we are deeply, partisanized, so to speak. So it's not, you can't expect to fully evade that, but you can also create spaces in which like not everything is set up around partisanship, which is how these spaces tend to be set up, right? Which is, okay, when we vote, we register as a Democratic or a Democrat or Republican or whatever. We go to the polling station and there's a Democratic official and a Republican official. Everything is set up in a highly partisan way, right? On many ballots, it tells you which party the person's with. Everything is set up to reinforce that sense that this is a partisan thing, right? Whereas in the context of citizen assembly, that kind of coding, that kind of nudging typically is not there. The goal is, okay, let's learn about evidence together. Let's discuss that evidence together. Let's set some benchmarks, things that we care about, not, what party are you on? Sit on that side of the room and talk with people from your party. Maybe, partisanship is something that we don't want to lose. There are really important values to having that kind of aggregative power, that collective power. But the theory of this context is to say, actually, when people meet each other face to face and have to deliberate together about issues of common concern, they might be able to find a kind of clarity that the partisan dynamics are inhibiting.
Thank you so much. We have about enough time for one last question.
If there's no one, I can ask my question. I want to ask both of you because in each of your presentations you've mentioned the word game, right? And you've sort of used game in sort of two different senses. One is to kind of like gauge how people would react or respond in a particular situation, sort of like an assessment of where people are politically, or how they engage politically at some particular point in time. But in a different sense, I've been noticing how game is also coming up as a term to explore alternative modes of engagement. And I'm curious for both of you, how do you see gaming as a very useful tool to explore politics in both senses? And perhaps also this leads to my also like I wanted Nathan also to talk a lot more about like your lab, like what do you actually do in that lab when you say you use gaming design to for particular like purpose is to explore like sort of like political governance. Yeah.
Leah, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think of politics and games as really close together. I think they have a lot in common. They have rules. You know, when the Girl Scouts today were voting about which snack to have at the end of the meeting, you know, we had to really make sure that they didn't just grab the snacks first. They had to go through the process. You know, right now we're dealing with the question about norm violation in our election processes that are really threatening the heart of the process. And I learned a lot from, you know, a classic book by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, Homo Ludens, who explore, you know, in this book written in during World War II, explored the ways in which games just fill our culture in all sorts of ways, and that learning to game well is a really important part of citizenship and belonging and culture. And so I do think there's a lot to learn from this. Actually, the organization Metagov started out because a German game company was trying to think about how to enable different kinds of player self-governance in the game, and they approached the Harvard legal scholar Lawrence Lessig about how do we do this, and that was kind of the birth of the project. In terms of what we do in MedLab, my lab, we the game related project was a mod for a game called Mind Test, which is a kind of open source clone of Minecraft that enables groups of people to define governance structures within the game. And I got interested in this just because I actually came out of a colleague's study who was researching Minecraft servers and found that they kept replicating really top-down hierarchical structures and how they were organized. And I had a hypothesis that this is actually really constrained by the fact that the tools are not there for them to do anything different. So I worked on developing that mod to test the question of whether with different kinds of tools people would behave differently. We're still working on the mod, so we don't have an answer to that. But actually, the process of developing it has been really instructive for me. It's been one of the most powerful experiences for me in testing my own assumptions about how online systems might work, and recognizing also how baked in some very kind of rigid and hierarchical structures are. Finally, games are experiences, and they're things that people enjoy. And I think of it as a space in which people could have good governance experiences. And in some cases they do actually. And so I'm really interested in gaming as a space to reach people and to invite them into a democratic culture.
So the land use exercise I mentioned is actually a thing that local planners do a lot of, which is how do they get people to imagine what they want communities to look like? And so there's lots of processes that literally use Legos. The one I was talking about had like stickers of where you would put the buildings. Some of these things look surprisingly like SimCity. I was part of a large grant working with engineers after a flood here in Boulder, where the engineers did all this calculation around flood damage. And we literally created a tabletop game where a group played together, where they had to decide what kind of house they wanted to build, and how, like with playing with Monopoly money. And part of what it tried to do was to get them to interact with expert knowledge around building in a really approachable way. And because it was a group, people were forced to account for and explain why they wanted things. And from a research perspective, that actually gave us really good insight to how they thought about these decisions that often are kind of taken for granted. And we actually argued that if we want to be thinking about kind of building resilient communities, which much of the world is interested in, that this type of gaming interaction is a way of both interacting with expert knowledge, but doing it in a way that builds the capacity to think together with other people about how we could do things differently and some of the trade-offs around that. And so I think there's lots of use of kind of games as these like fun, approachable, imaginary spaces. The last thing I'll say, Bob Craig started theorizing deliberation itself as a type of what he calls deliberative play. And part of this is the argument that instead of thinking about deliberation as either like cooperative or competitive, maybe it's this like dynamic mix of both simultaneously. And what is it to kind of create a space where there's an interactional frame where what people are doing when they're engaged in a lot of these activities is both like serious and make-believe. It's both hypothetical and consequential. And so if anyone here is interested in deliberation, I think that's another way of theorizing and thinking about deliberation as an activity that actually nicely connects to broader notions of play.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Leah and Nathan for the wonderful discussion today. They have given us a sneak peek of their research, so be sure to register for their solo webinar events. Leah's presentation, Making Non-Answers Hearable, will take place on February 4, and Nathan's governable spaces and democratic design for online life is scheduled for December 11. To register and also stay updated on our upcoming events, don't forget to sign up for our emailing list at talkingpolitics.org. And if you would like to revisit any part of the presentation, or if you have friends who couldn't make it today, we will be sharing a link to our recording of the presentation at a later date through our mailing list. Thank you once again to Leah and Nathan for joining us today and sharing your insights. We are now transitioning into the watch party session, where we invite our audience to share their thoughts and insights on this year's election. Leah and Nathan, you're welcome to stay and participate if you'd like, but we completely understand if you need to go. Now let's open the space for a more interactive discussion. We're eager to hear your thoughts, experiences, and any questions you might have about the presidential elections or the topics we've explored today. Let's hear from our audience.
Yeah, to sort of like ease the pressure on like putting people on the spot to talk, like the Talking Politics team is trying this event, like talking about games, right? Like our Talking Politics team, when we're thinking about like novel spaces, creating novel spaces for people to interact with each other, we were thinking about how this time round we want to try like a different format instead of like a usual like lecture type like webinar format style. And so we were thinking about like, you know, the limitations of Zoom, for instance, as a kind of like interactive space. Like there's always like at any one time one single interaction, that one single conversation that's happening at any time. It's really hard for people to kind of like have cross talk, and very hard to have like meta talk in these spaces. So we it's really funny coming this is like, I mean, Talking Politics started 4 years ago, and we tried like a couple where we were thinking about different sorts of platforms. One of them was also Gather.town, which is some like a kind of a small, I don't know if all of you have heard of that before, but it's like kind of like a small like RPG type character where you can move around a virtual space. Yeah, that also had like limitations as well. But yeah, just thinking a lot along the line and just like sort of like creating all of these spaces and see where they carry us. And I really hope, I mean, this is often like we all imagine, like from our side, this space to sort of talking politics to be a more interactive series than all other. You generally do have a lot of university-based like political series and virtual series. We kind of want to define ourselves like different from that model, separate from those models. So if y'all have any thoughts and ideas or feedback or suggestions for us and what we should be doing for the future, just let us know. We are always we always want feedback and how we can proceed forward. Yeah.